Welcome to video number 3 about my theory of developmental stuttering. Recall in the first video I presented this causal chain. I assume that stuttering is caused by insufficient attention to the auditory channel when speaking. Thereby, the auditory feedback of speech is poorly processed, which elicits invalid error signals in the monitoring system, and they interrupt the speech flow and cause stuttering. This video is about the third step or link of the causal chain. Invalid error signal means that the automatic monitoring system in the brain misevaluates the poorly processed auditory feedback and finds errors although no real speech error occurred. The idea that some kind of error signal in the feedback loop may cause stuttering is not new, and in this video I'll report on the history and development of this idea, which led to some significantly different hypotheses of what may cause such error signals. Developmental stuttering is a variable disorder. Symptoms don't occur permanently. Most stutterers can speak fluently for some time, but more or less frequently moments of stuttering occur. From there it was obvious to assume that something may go wrong in the brain immediately before a moment of overt stuttering. It was also known that a change in how a stutterer hears himself speak can markedly reduce stuttering, for instance loud noise in the environment or a large reverberant room. And it was known that stuttering was rare among deaf people. This suggested that stuttering may be caused by a problem with the auditory feedback of speech. This assumption got a scientific basis when Grant Fairbanks, 1954, published his paper about the speech mechanism as a servo system. In control technology, a servo system is a closed-cycle system, comparing the feedback of the output to the input, and manipulating the output-producing device so that the output has the same functional form as the input. This is figure 5 from Fairbanks' paper, showing two speakers talking to each other. The brain in speaker 1 formulates a message, and the speaking mechanism articulates it and sends it to the ear of speaker 2. Speaker 2's brain understands the message and formulates a reply, message 2, which is again articulated by the speaking mechanism and sent to the ear of speaker 1, whose brain understands it, and so on. It's very simple. This is figure 6, showing the left half of the previous figure with speaker 1 only. And here the message is sent not only to the interlocutor, but also fed back to the speaker's ear. This auditory feedback is compared to an expectation or prediction of how the intended message should sound like. And a mismatch between prediction and feedback, if it exceeds a certain threshold, is an error. And the error is used to adapt the performance of the speaking mechanism so that the feedback matches the expectation or prediction. This is Fairbanks' elaborate model of a closed-cycle control system for speaking. I don't want to explain this in detail, but the input comes from a language system that formulates messages. This is the effector unit consisting of 3 parts: a motor unit, that's respiration, a generator unit, the vocal cords, and a modulator unit for articulation. The effector unit produces the speech output, and this is the auditory feedback in 2 components, air-conducted and bone-conducted, received by the ears in the sensory unit, which compares it to a prediction derived from the input. You don't need to remember all this. The important things are that a closed-cycle control system uses the feedback of the output to control the system's behavior, and that in such a model an error is a mismatch between sensory prediction or expectation and sensory feedback. The first researchers who wrote about invalid error signals as a possible cause of stuttering were Jean-Anne Maraist and Charles Hutton, 1957. Based on Fairbanks' servo system model of the speech mechanism, they speculated that According to this theory, the stutterer misevaluates his overt speech output at some point in the control system and finds error where in reality no error exists. The result of the attempt to correct this non-existent error is stuttering behavior. Initially, problems with audition were suspected to cause invalid error signals, more specifically, an aberrant interaction between air and bond-conducted auditory feedback. As a possible cause, Webster and Lubker in 1968 proposed the malfunction of the middle ear muscles. But this wasn't confirmed in a study conducted by Howell, Marchbanks, and Elianiv, published in 1986. Courtney Stromsta, 1972, assumed an abnormal perception of auditory feedback due to a greater intraoral phase disparity in stutterers. But Gregory and Mangan, 1982, who replicated Stromsta's experiment, couldn't confirm his results. In 1992, the Dutch psycholinguists Albert Postma and Herman Kolk published a study in which they tested the theory that, I quote, disordered auditory feedback creates the illusion that some kind of error has intruded into the speech flow, and that stuttering results from actions aimed to correct the suspected but non-existent error. In the experiment, stutterers and normally fluent controls had to detect self-produced phonemic speech errors while speaking either with normal auditory feedback or with auditory feedback being masked by white noise. Postma and Kolk apparently presumed that stutterers notice abnormal errors in their auditory feedback if such errors occur. The two groups didn't differ in error detection accuracy and speed, nor in the number of false alarms. And the authors conclude that there is no defect in auditory feedback and that the self-monitoring of speech works normally in stutterers. However, they didn't reject the idea that some kind of error signal may cause stuttering. 1 year later, they published their famous covered repair hypothesis. They proposed that not a seeming error due to a problem with auditory feedback caused stuttering, but a real error in phonological encoding, that is, in speech planning, before articulation. The covered repair hypothesis should be well known, and since it isn't about invalid error signals, I won't go into it in detail here. Brocklehurst and Corley, 2011, tested the covered repair hypothesis in a behavioral experiment and came to the conclusion that their results didn't support the hypothesis that stuttering-like disfluencies in everyday speech stem from covered repairs of errors of phonological encoding. Also in the Netherlands, at the University of Utrecht, Nada Vasic and Frank Wijnen conducted an interesting experiment which was first presented at a congress of the International Speech Communication Association in 2001 and later published in a book in 2005. The study is interesting because of the hypothesis that was tested and because, to my knowledge, it's the only study so far in which explicitly the effect of attention to auditory feedback on stuttering was examined. Briefly put, the hypothesis was that stutterers excessively monitor their speech and that their oversensitive monitoring system takes normal discontinuities in speech flow for errors, and the attempt to avoid or correct these non-existent errors causes stuttering. However, more recent empirical findings don't support this hypothesis. Tsai et al. 2014 found stutterers to exhibit weaker compensatory responses to unexpected time-varying perturbations in their auditory feedback. And DIVA et al. 2020 found a poorer auditory temporal resolution in stutterers as compared with normal speakers. Given these findings, I think the hypothesis of an oversensitivity to discontinuities in speech flow can be considered refuted. But astonishingly, the experimental results obtained by Vasic and Wijnen appear to support their hypothesis. So let's look at the experiment. Adult stutterers produced self-formulated speech in 3 conditions. The first condition was speaking only. The second one was speaking while playing the computer game Pong, in which participants played table tennis against the computer. This was supposed to take away general resources, so that less capacity would be left for speech monitoring. In the third condition, subjects were speaking and concurrently monitoring for a particular word in their speech production, namely the Dutch word die, which means that in English and which is a fairly frequent word in Dutch. Participants had to press a button each time they heard die in their speech. This was designed to alter the focus of monitoring, away from fluency and instead toward the lexical content. But clearly, participants focused on their auditory feedback in this condition. Here you can see the results. I drew this diagram according to the table in the book. Both dual task conditions reduced the number of blocks. And blocks were by far the most frequent type of disfluencies that occurred in the study. 10% blocks occurred per total number of words during speaking only. 9% with playing Pong, and 5% in the monitoring D condition. These results appear to support the author's hypothesis, but I think there's an alternative account for the results. In the Pong condition, subjects were required to adopt an external focus of attention. More recent studies showed that additional tasks requiring an external focus of attention while speaking reduced stuttering and improved speech motor control, respectively, in children and adults who stuttered. I discussed the importance of adopting an external focus of attention while speaking extensively in my first video on this channel. There I also explain why the best external focus of attention when speaking is that on auditory feedback. And just this focus of attention was required in the monitoring D condition. The participants had to listen to their speech and to press the button when they heard themselves saying D. So it isn't surprising that the number of blocks was smallest in this condition. My account for the results obtained by Vasic and Wijnen is therefore that the Pong condition reduced stuttering by distraction from an internal focus of attention. That is, not distraction from excessive monitoring, as Vasic and Wijnen assumed, but from excessive speech planning and voluntary motor control. And the monitoring D condition reduced stuttering more effectively by drawing attention to the auditory feedback of speech. I now come to some theories that have been very influential in the last 2 decades. In 2004, Ludo Max and others published a paper with 2 hypotheses on the cause of stuttering. They were developed using the DIVA model, among others, a neural network computer model of speech motor skill acquisition and speech production, developed by Frank Günther at Boston University. DIVA is the abbreviation for Directions into Velocities of Articulators. As I said, Max and colleagues proposed 2 hypotheses, namely that stuttering may result when producing speech either with unstable or insufficiently activated neural models, or with a motor strategy weighted too much toward afferent feedback control. Let's first consider the second hypothesis, which was again presented by Sevier, Taco and Günther 2010. The crucial afferent feedback in speaking, of course, is auditory feedback. And the authors assume that, when speech movements are too much controlled by auditory feedback, the delay in arrival of these feedback signals may render the system unstable. This may lead to production errors, which cause the motor system to reset and repeat the current syllable. That is, in this hypothesis, they assume real errors, not invalid error signals to trigger stuttering. The main problem with this hypothesis is that it predicts normal or even enhanced compensatory responses to alterations of auditory feedback. But subsequent studies have shown the opposite, at least in adults who stutter, namely delayed or weaker vocal compensations of auditory feedback perturbations in pitch, and, as already mentioned, weaker articulatory responses to time-varying perturbations of auditory feedback. Bradshaw, Lametti and McGettigan 2021 analyzed feedback theories of stuttering on the basis of their predictions regarding their compensatory responses to unexpected auditory feedback perturbations. And they conclude that the overall pattern of evidence speaks directly against the over-reliance on feedback hypothesis, despite this being a highly influential theory in the field. The other hypothesis proposed by Mefferd et al. 2004, that's the first one in their paper, says that stuttering may result when speaking with unstable or insufficiently activated internal models. What are internal models? They translate between motor commands and their associated sensory outcomes. Forward models translate motor commands into predictions of their sensory consequences, and inverse models translate sensory outcomes fed back into motor commands. They serve to correct or update the motor commands. Max and colleagues offered two possibilities within their first hypothesis. Problems may arise by instability or insufficient activation of either inverse models or feed-forward models. The first possibility assumes problems with inverse models. This would result in inaccurate feed-forward commands, and when they are executed, their sensory consequences don't match the desired consequences. This results in an increased need for feedback-based corrections, including interruptions or resets of the feed-forward commands that give rise to sound or syllable repetitions and sound prolongations. However, I think this would again amount to an over-reliance on auditory feedback, and as we saw earlier, that's not supported by the data. The second possibility within the first hypothesis proposed by Max and colleagues is a problem with forward models. As already said, forward models translate motor commands into sensory predictions. This is figure 1 from Max et al. 2004. Below, feed-forward control. Incorrect or unstable inverse models in the motor command preparation would result in incorrect movements. That was the first possibility. And now the second possibility. In feedback control, incorrect or unstable feed-forward models result in incorrect predictions, and due to this a mismatch arises between prediction and feedback. Feedback is this, afferent signals. Strangely, in this figure, prediction isn't compared with feedback but with movement goal, and that's not the same. But in the text they write that a mismatch may arise between predicted and actual consequences of the executed movement, and the actual consequences of an executed movement are perceived via sensory feedback. Further, they write, as a result of such a mismatch, the central nervous system may respond by reattempting the movement and reissuing the central commands or generating a different set of commands. These types of attempted repairs could result in prolonged or repeated muscle contractions, that is, in stuttering. Similar hypotheses were proposed by Gregory Hickok, John Hood and Feng Rang in 2011 and by Tian and David Poeppel in 2012. These papers are not mainly about stuttering, they propose models of speech processing, but they each include a hypothesis about the cause of stuttering. Hickok, Hood and Rang proposed their hypothesis in the framework of their state feedback control model of speech production, and from them I've adopted the term invalid error signal. They assume that the mapping between the internal model of the vocal tract and the sensory system is noisy. This results in an incorrect auditory prediction which triggers an invalid error signal when compared to the acoustically represented sensory target provided from the lexical system. That is, the invalid error signal here is not due to a mismatch between incorrect auditory prediction and auditory feedback, but as in the figure by Max and colleagues, between incorrect prediction and sensory goal. Tian and Poeppel 2012 proposed a hypothesis about stuttering in the framework of a simulation activation mechanism of the interaction between motor and sensory system. They assume that a deficit in motor to sensory transformation causes a mismatch between incorrect predictions and sensory feedback. Hickok, Hood and Rang emphasized the similarity of their hypothesis to that proposed by Max et al. 2004. And Tian and Poeppel also explicitly write that their hypothesis is along to the lines of those by Max et al. And Hickok, Hood and Rang. So I think I don't oversimplify by treating the three hypotheses as one. Like Bradshaw, Lametti and McGettigan 2021, I'll call it the unstable internal models account. The core of the account is that a noisy or in some way incorrect mapping or translation between motor and sensory system causes incorrect sensory predictions, which results in invalid error signals, and the attempt to correct these non-existent errors manifests itself in stuttering. From this account it results a testable prediction. Correct sensory predictions are necessary for the detection and online correction of real errors in sensory feedback. Accordingly, Bradshaw, Lametti and McGettigan 2021 write that the unstable internal models account would predict an impaired ability to detect and correct for sensory errors online, resulting in weaker or more variable compensation responses. This prediction was confirmed in several studies, I already mentioned them, in which stutterers showed delayed or weaker vocal compensations for unexpected auditory feedback perturbations in pitch, and weaker articulatory responses to time-varying perturbations of auditory feedback. However, making this prediction of weaker compensations for auditory feedback perturbations in stutterers is not unique to the unstable internal models account. My theory, for example, predicts the same, not because of unstable internal models, but because of habitually reduced attention to auditory feedback when speaking. So the question arises, what caused the stutterers' weaker or delayed compensatory responses in those studies? Unstable internal models and thereby incorrect auditory predictions, or reduced attention to auditory feedback, and thereby poor processing and integration of this feedback information? That's unclear, but recall the studies with normal speakers that I reported on in my previous video. Tumber, Shearer and Jones 2014 and 2016 and Liu et al. 2015 found weaker compensatory responses to pitch perturbations with distraction from auditory feedback as compared with focus on auditory feedback. So I think there is some evidence that weaker responses of stutterers to auditory feedback perturbations may result from reduced attention to auditory feedback. Especially because Lazzari et al. 2024 found that stutterers could ignore their auditory feedback in a finger-tapping task, but non-stutterers could not, although they were asked to do so, suggesting that the integration of auditory feedback in motor control when something audible is produced by movement is less automatic in stutterers than in normal speakers. I reported about that study extensively in the first video on this channel. Hickok, Hood and Rang 2011 and Tian and Poeppel 2012 tried to explain the effects of choral speech and altered auditory feedback on stuttering by means of the unstable internal models account. I've discussed this on my website. You can find the link addresses under the video. Before I will explain the role of invalid error signals in my theory, Let's take a look at some different types of speech errors. We can distinguish between errors affecting physical features of speech, such as loudness, pitch, or rate, and errors affecting linguistic features, such as phonology, grammar, syntax, or semantics. In the aforementioned studies of compensatory responses to feedback perturbations, only responses to physical errors were tested. These studies are significant as they indicate that speech control in stutterers doesn't overly rely on auditory feedback. To the contrary, auditory feedback seems to be less involved in speech control in stutterers. But I don't assume that this type of errors plays any role in the causation of stuttering. Physical speech errors can be corrected online by speaking louder or slower, for example, without interrupting one's speech. And I think stutterers have no difficulty doing this in everyday situations, if they become aware that they are too low or too fast. But that's not least a matter of attention to auditory feedback. The type of errors that I assume they play a role in stuttering are linguistic errors. If they are detected in auditory feedback, an interruption of speech flow is needed to make a correction. The Dutch psycholinguist Bauerly Mefferd describes this in his book Speaking, published in 1995. Based on behavioral studies, he formulated his main interruption rule. Stop the flow of speech immediately upon detecting trouble. With trouble meaning a mismatch between prediction and feedback. An important question is whether this interruption of speech is automatic, a kind of conditioned reflex, or depending on the speaker's free conscious decision. I assume that it is automatic after some subtypes of linguistic errors, for instance after phonological errors. I'll explain and justify this in detail in my next video, which will be about how invalid error signals cause stuttering. Here I can only briefly outline this connection. This figure shows a comparison between the detection of a real speech error on the left and the occurrence of an invalid error signal due to poor processing of auditory feedback on the right. A real speech error in auditory feedback, normally processed and transmitted to the monitor, causes a mismatch between prediction and feedback, and this evokes an error signal that automatically interrupts speaking. Concurrently, the error signal causes a shift of attention. The speaker becomes aware of what mistake he or she made and corrects it. That's the normal way. Now let's look how stuttering comes about in my theory. Auditory feedback without any error is poorly processed because of insufficient attention to the auditory channel. For example, the feedback of a correctly produced word is incompletely transmitted to the monitor. As with a real error, a mismatch between prediction and feedback evokes an error signal which interrupts speaking. But an attentional shift to the error doesn't take place because no error occurred. So the speaker automatically tries to continue. And this attempt to continue, despite the speech flow being blocked or inhibited, causes overt stuttering symptoms. That is, stuttering is not caused by the attempt to correct a non-existent error, as was assumed in all the other error theories of stuttering. Instead, overt symptoms occur because the stutterer is not aware of any error. More about this in my next video. Let's summarize. Invalid error signals are error signals that occur even though the speaker hasn't made any mistake. 4 different hypotheses have suggested that invalid error signals may trigger stuttering. Impaired external hearing and oversensitivity to normal discontinuities in speech flow as hypothesized causes for invalid error signals were not supported by empirical findings. The hypothesis that unstable or insufficiently activated internal models impair motor to sensory translation, resulting in incorrect auditory predictions, which elicits invalid error signals due to a mismatch between those predictions and correct auditory feedback, is consistent with the data. However, my theory is consistent with the same data, namely with weaker or delayed compensatory responses of stutterers to unexpected alterations of auditory feedback, since this could also result from habitually reduced attention to auditory feedback. I propose that invalid error signals occur when auditory feedback is poorly processed due to insufficient attention to the auditory channel. In my theory, stuttering doesn't occur because the speaker tries to correct a non-existent error, but because the invalid error signal automatically triggers an interruption of speech flow, a motor inhibition, and the speaker, despite of this, tries to continue. Like the others who suggested that invalid error signals cause stuttering, I can't provide any evidence for this, and it may be impossible to test this hypothesis. But I think the concept of invalid error signals can help us understand the mechanism underlying developmental stuttering. And my stuttering theory is easily testable as a whole, since it predicts that increased attention to auditory feedback reduces stuttering. That's it for now. You can find all the references on my website and the document indices also under the video. Thank you for your interest and attention. If you have any questions or objections, please leave a comment.